Stipuam. The boy collapsed at the base of Boone's porch steps, just as the first nail struck red from the forge. The hammer slipped from Boone's calloused hand, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. He stood still for a second, staring across the yard, the sound of cicadas humming low like a warning. The boy's shirt was torn through the shoulder, slick with something darker than sweat. Blood had soaked the fabric, dripping into the powdery dust. Boone's boots moved before his mind caught up. He crossed the yard in long strides, kneeling just as the boy tried to speak. Dry lips moved with no sound. Then a whisper clawed its way from the boy's throat. "I don't matter," he rasped, "but my sister does. When they come and they will hide her, let them take me." The boy's fingers clutched Boone's boot like a drowning hand grabbing the root of a tree. Boone knelt beside him, eyes searching the horizon, scanning beyond the mesquite line. There was nothing yet, but the stillness in the air felt unnatural, like the land was holding its breath. "What's your name?" Boone asked. The boy coughed. "Emmett. Emmett Two Hill." Boone eased him up. The kid couldn't have been more than 12 bones like dry willow and eyes too old for that face. He was light, too light. Boone carried him inside, laying him on the cot beside the hearth. The boy gritted his teeth as Boone peeled the shirt back and found the gash deep, ugly, done by a knife that meant business. Boone rinsed the wound with whiskey, and the boy flinched, but didn't cry out. Not once. "She's by the creek," Emmett said, as Boone tied off the cloth. "Near the big rock in the brush. 7 years old. Won't speak since they killed Mama." Boone's hands froze. He asked, "Barrett Claymore's men." Emmett's voice cracked. "They came for the papers. Shot my father, shot Mama. I grabbed Willa. We ran. Claymore." The name was a curse out here. Ranch baron with fingers in every sheriff's pocket, and half the land titles forged under his own name. Boone had heard stories, burned farms, vanished families, but stories were just smoke until you caught a whiff of fire. "You've been running long, 2 days. Boone looked out the window. The sun was already beginning its late-day descent, painting the hills with that mean red light that made shadows long and hearts uneasy. He stood and grabbed the rifle off the wall. The steel was cool and familiar in his grip. "Stay put," Boone said. "You'll hear me before you see me." "She won't come easy," Emmett warned, his voice fading. "She don't trust nobody." Boone glanced back. "She doesn't need to. She just needs to be found." He stepped out into the heat. The air was thick with the scent of old, sweat-dry grass and the faint metallic tang of blood. His boots crunched over brittle earth as he headed toward the creek, the rifle slung low in one hand, sun behind his back, memories pressed against him as he walked his own daughter Clara, playing along that very creek 6 years ago, counting minnows in the shallows before the fever took her. Margaret's laughter echoing from the forge as she brought him bread. That life was buried now, ashes under his ribs, but the ground remembered. So did Boone. He reached the bend where the water ran deeper, shaded by cottonwood and tangled brush. He crouched low and called gently. "Willa, my name's Boone Redhawk. Your brother sent me. He's hurt, but he's safe. He's waiting for you." No answer. Only the chorus of insects and the soft glug of the current. Boone stayed where he was, letting the silence settle. "He said you're brave," he added. "Said you ran all the way out here alone." Still nothing. He sat down on a patch of warm rock, letting his voice find a quieter rhythm. "I had a daughter once," he said. "Clara. When she got scared, she'd hide behind the hay in the barn. Thought I couldn't find her, but I always did." He waited. Time passed like syrup in the sun. "You like to draw?" he asked. "Your brother says you're good." Maybe when we get back you can show me. A rustle. Boone didn't look. Just let his voice stay soft. I brought her a little wooden horse once. She named it Sweet Pea. Used to brush its mane with a stick. The rustling grew closer. Then a small hand touched his sleeve. Boone turned. She was there. Hair tangled with dry leaves, a tear in her dress, and dirt on her cheeks, but her eyes were wide and clear. Blue-green like sunlit river stone. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There you are, Boone said gently. Let's go see your brother. She nodded barely and took his hand. The walk back was silent. Her grip stayed tight even though her steps slowed near the edge of the yard. The house looked more weathered in the amber light, like it knew what kind of burden it now carried. Boone opened the door. Emmett sat upright on the cot. When he saw her, his face crumpled. Willa ran to him, wrapping herself around his chest, like she could hold the world together with just her arms. He winced from the pain, but didn't let go. Boone gave them space. He moved to the window and scanned the ridge. The wind shifted, and with it came a scent he didn't like. Horse sweat. Dust churned not by wind, but hooves. How far behind are they? Boone asked quietly. Emmett's voice was muffled in Willa's hair. We lost them near Anvil Wash. But they've got a tracker. Tucker Gray. Never fails. Boone's gut tensed. He'd heard of Tucker. A man who followed more than footprints, he followed breath, fear, blood. Boone turned from the window and met Emmett's eyes. You got food, water, a place to hide if it comes to that. And you, Emmett asked. I don't run anymore. Willa looked up at him then. Just a moment. Just enough. Boone checked the chamber of his rifle. 6 rounds. It'd have to do. The sun dipped below the ridge, lighting the sky in red and gold. And still no one was taking anyone. Not tonight. Not ever again. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at him from the brush like a wounded animal, and Boone knew whatever had happened, words had not survived it. The girl hadn't said a single word since Boone led her home through the rising heat. She'd held tight to his hand, her little fingers wrapped like roots around his, but her eyes stayed fixed on the ground. Not watching where she stepped, just refusing to look up, as if the world would swallow her whole if she dared meet its gaze. Boone kept her close as they neared the cabin. When they stepped inside, Willa froze. Emmett stirred on the cot, pale and drawn, and the moment his eyes found hers, his breath hitched. Willa. She stood frozen at the doorway. Come here, sis, Emmett said, trying to sit up, wincing through clenched teeth. She blinked once, then crossed the room in 3 small steps and climbed onto the bed beside him. She curled into his side like a pup under its mother's flank, her face buried in the folds of his torn shirt. She made no sound, not even a sob, just held on. Boone turned away, giving them a moment. He went to the water barrel, poured some into a tin cup, and set it on the table. His hands were steady, but something inside him was not. He hadn't heard a child's voice in 6 years. He busied himself with splitting wood for the stove, working quietly, letting the scrape and thud of the axe fill the silence. When he looked up again, Willa had fallen asleep, still curled against her brother, her hands gripping his shirt like she expected him to vanish. Emmett's eyes met Boone's across the room. You found her, he said hoarsely. I didn't think you'd. Boone raised a hand. You don't need to thank me. Emmett tried to smile. It failed. She's been like that since it happened. Hasn't said a word. She will, Boone replied, when she's ready. He set another log on the chopping block. How long have you two been running, since the night they came? We hid in the dry well the first night. After that, just ran, slept under bushes, ate prickly pears and creek frogs. Boone nodded slowly. He knew what survival looked like on a child. This was it. Hollow cheeks, silent stares, feet that moved long after they should have given out. "She's got grit," Boone said. Emmett looked down at his sister, brushing a twig from her tangled hair. "She's tougher than me." Boone said nothing, just kept working, slicing the silence with rhythm and weight. The last light faded from the sky. Boone lit a lantern, low and dim. He handed Emmett a plate with dry bread and a slice of salt pork. The boy ate slow, careful not to wake the girl beside him. "She doesn't sleep unless she's near me," Emmett said. "She'll rest tonight," Boone answered. They sat in the quiet. The fire cracked once in the hearth. Outside, coyotes yipped in the distance, their voices thin against the darkening hills. Boone poured 2 cups of water and handed one to Emmett. The boy sipped. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Boone didn't answer right away. He sat in the chair by the hearth and looked into the flames like he was reading a language only he knew. "Because nobody helped me," Boone said finally. Emmett lowered his cup. "What happened to you?" "My wife died first. Fever. Then my daughter Clara followed her 3 days later. I buried them behind this house." Boone's voice didn't shake. "No one came. Nobody asked how I was. I didn't leave the property for 6 years." Emmett's throat worked around a hard swallow. "I'm sorry." Boone nodded once. "So am I." Willa shifted in her sleep. Emmett glanced at her, then looked back toward the window. The land outside was thick with shadow now. The kind of dark where bad things move easier. "They'll come, won't they?" "They're already on their way," Boone said. "They've got Tucker Gray with them. That tracker. He's not like other men. He doesn't need footprints. He finds heat fear. He smells blood like a wolf." Boone remembered the stories. A man who could read the land like scripture, who could follow hoofbeats through stone. He'd hoped they were just tales passed through saloons. They weren't. Boone stood crossed to the wall and retrieved a leather roll tied with twine. He unfurled it on the table inside 2 Colt revolvers rested oiled and ready. Beside them a knife with a carved handle worn smooth. Emmett's eyes widened. "You were a soldier?" Boone nodded. "Rail scout during the war. Then I worked for men who needed quiet help when the law wasn't listening." Gunslinger Boone met his gaze. "Protector." Emmett seemed to weigh that word, then nodded. Boone holstered the pistols, moved to the cabinet, and retrieved a cloth sack. He began packing it with dried beans, flour, a tin of lard, and a length of rope. "I want you both to stay in the root cellar tonight," Boone said. "No lamps, no noise. There's a cot down there and water. What about you? I'll be outside, watching the ridge." Emmett sat straighter. "I can help." "You've done enough," Boone replied. "You brought her here. That's more courage than most grown men." The boy's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Boone reached into a drawer and handed Emmett a small iron key. "If something happens, there's a back tunnel in the cellar. It was built during the old raids. Follow it. You'll come out near the dry creek bend." "Where do we go, Copper Springs?" "Find a woman named Sister Miriam Clay. She'll know what to do." Emmett stared at him. "Will you be okay?" Boone turned toward the door. "I'm not the one they're after." As he stepped out into the night air, Boone paused, feeling the cold press of a child's eyes behind him. He didn't look back. The moon hung low over the hills, casting silver lines across the dirt. Boone crossed the yard and climbed to the East Ridge, rifle in hand. He lay flat against the earth, breathing slow, letting the scent of sagebrush and dust fill his lungs. Below the road curved like a snake vanishing into the black. No torches, no silhouettes, but the air had changed, like a silence right before thunder. Boone waited and watched and did not blink. Somewhere out there men were coming, and they weren't taking anyone. They thought he was just an old cowboy with a limp, but Boone hadn't limped for 6 years, and tonight he remembered why. The night held its breath. Boone lay still beneath the sweep of stars, his cheek pressed to the cold dirt of the ridge. His rifle lay quiet beside him, but his fingers twitched against the stock. He could smell the trail dust drifting in on the wind horses, maybe 5 or 6, and sweat that didn't belong to the land. They were close now, closer than he wanted them to be. Down below the cabin sat dark and still. No flicker of lantern, no movement from the shuttered windows. The cellar door was covered with a scattering of split wood and rusted buckets just as Boone had planned. Hidden, but not forgotten. He shifted slightly, knees pressing into the scrub, and let his eyes adjust to the motionless dark. The horizon held nothing but the sway of dry brush and the long spine of cottonwoods that bordered the gulch. Then, just for a breath, he saw it. A shadow moved, then another. One paused. The tip of a cigarette flared red in the dark. A fool's glow. Boone slid backward from the ridge and disappeared behind the rocks. Every move was measured, silent, controlled. He reached the fence line and crouched behind the rain barrel near the corral. One boot moved slightly to the side, revealing a patch of trampled grass he'd cleared earlier. A blind spot. A trap. They were creeping in from the west, assuming they'd corner him by surprise. Like he was still a man who limped and drank and had let his reflexes rust. But Boone hadn't limped in years, and he'd never once forgotten how to fight. He waited until they were in the yard, 3 of them too staying back near the trees. Only the ones up front were reckless enough to approach the house without scouting first. Amateurs. Gunslingers with loud mouths and no memory for dust-born veterans who used to track men like them before breakfast. Boone moved fast. He stepped out from behind the barrel and fired once clean through the wrist of the man who'd drawn first. The man cried out, his pistol skidding across the porch. Before the second could react, Boone had him face down in the dirt boot pressed against the back of his neck, the rifle barrel resting between his shoulder blades. The third man froze. Boone didn't speak. He just tilted his head slowly, calmly. Behind him, the man underfoot groaned and writhed, blood slicking the dust. "Tell Tucker Gray," Boone said evenly. "He's got one chance to walk away. One. He sends boys like you again, he'll get them back in pieces." The third man blinked hands, raised fear pooling in the hollow of his throat. Boone removed his boot, yanked the wounded man to his feet, and shoved him toward the trees. "Go," he growled. "And don't stop running." They stumbled back into the dark, tripping over each other, too dumb to understand. They just walked away alive from a man who used to leave no one breathing behind. Boone stood in the stillness, the smell of gunpowder lingering like burnt pine. His heart thudded steady but hard. He hadn't drawn his rifle in years. He'd buried that part of himself. But tonight, for the girl who didn't speak, and the boy who still believed someone would come for them, he'd unearthed it without a tremble. The silence returned, but it was different now, not heavy with threat, but pulsing with something older presence. Warning. Boone turned back toward the cabin and walked slowly, rifle resting against his shoulder. Inside, all was still. He opened the cellar door quietly and stepped down into the cool dark. Willa sat upright on the cot, eyes wide, staring into the dark, like she'd heard everything. Emmett was beside her, trying to breathe steady but not doing it well. Boone didn't speak. He just walked over and placed the rifle gently against the stone wall. Then he knelt. He looked Willa in the eye. They're gone. You're safe. She blinked once. Her fingers relaxed slightly around the edge of her blanket. Emmett spoke first. How many 3 tonight? Boone replied. They won't be back. Not those ones, at least. More'll come. Boone nodded. Willa didn't say a word, but her small hand reached toward Boone's coat, tugged once, then let go. A child's gesture, quiet but grateful. Boone placed a rough hand gently on her head. You were brave. She looked down, silent again. Boone turned to Emmett. We ride tomorrow, at first light. Emmett frowned. I thought you said to stay hidden. Plans changed, Boone said. You both leave at dawn. You'll follow the back trail east, cut through Bishop's Hollow, and ride hard to Copper Springs. You're not coming. Boone didn't answer immediately. He pulled up the stool and sat beside them. When you're small, he said quietly, you think justice is something someone hands you. A sheriff, a badge, a courtroom. Later you learn that justice is sometimes just not letting evil get away with it. He met Emmett's eyes. I'm not leaving your fight unfinished. Willa leaned against her brother's shoulder, eyelids heavy. She hadn't spoken. But now she whispered almost too soft to hear. Will you come find us after Boone swallowed? I will. Her eyes drifted closed. Upstairs, the wind knocked gently against the shutter. It sounded like a hush. Boone stood and walked to the ladder. As he climbed out, Emmett's voice followed him. My father. He wasn't like you. Boone paused. No, he left when things got hard. Boone nodded once, then stepped out into the night. By morning, the horses were saddled. Boone handed Emmett a map he'd drawn himself, River's landmarks, a line etched in charcoal showing the safe trail. Willa stood by the fence, wrapped in Boone's old wool coat. It hung off her like a curtain, but she didn't complain. She looked up at him, eyes still solemn, still silent, and lifted her hand to wave. Boone nodded. You ride until you see the copper bell tower. That's the place. Emmett mounted up. Willa climbed behind him. Boone adjusted the stirrup on his own horse, but didn't mount. You'll hear about me, he said quietly. Emmett frowned. What do you mean? Boone's eyes met his. Just remember, they came here thinking I was an old cowboy with a limp. Then he smiled, slow and strange. I haven't limped in 6 years. He turned and walked toward the hills, rifle across his back, the sun rising behind him like fire across the land. Every man has a line. Boone's had been crossed years ago, but this time he stepped over it willingly and left mercy behind him. Boone rode with the wind pulling at the edges of his coat, the trail behind him, long and covered in silence. The sun had barely lifted over the horizon, streaking the sky with pale fire, when he passed the burned husk of an old wagon station, abandoned now like too many places on this stretch of forgotten earth. He didn't glance at it. His eyes were fixed forward toward the ridge where smoke had been rising last night. A signal, or a warning. His jaw was set hard, and the stiffness in his shoulder had returned not from pain, but from memory. His horse picked up the scent of wolves and slowed near a creek bend, ears twitching. Boone dismounted, letting the reins fall to the ground. He knelt beside the creek, cupping water in his calloused hands and letting it run through his fingers. Cold, clean, honest. He had always known it would come to this. Not the cabin, not the girl or the boy, but the reckoning. He stood, rolled his shoulders once, and checked the rifle strapped across his back. Then he turned toward the hills and started walking. He left the horse behind. The trail narrowed past the rocks, winding into a canyon that hadn't seen a sheriff in 5 years. Boone remembered the last time he'd ridden this path. It was a lifetime ago, before Tucker Gray had turned from cattleman to cutthroat, before Boone had buried the man he used to be beneath a decade of quiet. He didn't bother hiding his steps. Tucker would already know he was coming. By mid-morning, he reached the ridge overlooking Gray Hollow, a crooked patch of land with broken fences and smoke-stained barns. Men moved like shadows near the corrals, rifles slung low. Boone counted 7, maybe more. Most would scatter once the shooting started. They always did. It was the ones who stayed that mattered. He descended slow, careful not to stir the dry gravel underfoot. The main house stood like a scar in the center of the hollow windows, shuttered chimney coughing black smoke. Boone walked straight up the center of the yard. He was halfway to the porch when the door creaked open. A man stepped out. Tucker Gray hadn't changed much. Hair silvered at the sides, gut thickened with greed, but the eyes, those black pinched eyes, were the same. Cruel, calculating, and too sure of themselves. "Well, I'll be Tucker," drawled. The ghost finally shows his face. Boone didn't blink. "You sent boys to my place." Tucker smirked. "Didn't know it was yours. Thought it was just some rundown shack housing a couple runaways. You knew exactly what it was." Tucker stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate. "You always were sentimental, Boone. Should have stayed buried in whatever hole you crawled into." "I might have," Boone said, voice low, "if you hadn't sent men to kill children." That drew a pause. Behind Tucker, 2 men raised rifles from the porch rail. Boone's eyes didn't move. "I'm not here to bargain," he said. "And I'm not here to warn you again." Tucker snorted. "So what then? You aiming to shoot your way through my entire crew?" Boone's fingers moved like a whisper. He fired first, 1 shot, 2. Both rifles on the porch dropped before they could spark. Then he moved. He rolled behind the water trough, bullets cracking overhead. Dust leapt from the ground like tiny storms. Boone fired once more. A man screamed and dropped from the roof edge, clutching his side. Tucker backed into the doorway, shouting orders. More men poured from the barn, but Boone was already at the shed, sliding behind cover, reloading smooth and fast. He was the kind of shot that didn't need to waste bullets. He didn't shoot to wound. The next minute passed in thunder. When the dust settled, 3 men were down, 1 running toward the trees, and the others too scared to move. Tucker stepped out again, this time slower. "I didn't think you still had it in you." Boone leveled the rifle. "I didn't either," he said. "But turns out I do." Tucker glanced toward the gate, calculating. "Look," he said, lifting his hands halfway. "You want the girl, take her. I didn't pay much for her anyhow. Just some dirty trade for a favor owed." Boone's knuckles went white around the stock. "You bought her. She was given to me." Tucker shrugged. Didn't ask questions. Her daddy owed a debt. Figured it was fair. Boone lowered the rifle, not to surrender, but to walk, straight up to Tucker, and hit him square in the mouth. The older man crumpled, blood stringing from his lip. Boone knelt beside him and spoke with steel in his throat. "You ever touch another child, you'll wish I left you dead here today." Tucker spat blood. "You ain't the law." "No," Boone said. "I'm what comes after." He stood, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots crunching dry dirt as he walked away from the hollow. Not a man looked him in the eye. He didn't look back. At the top of the ridge, he paused. The wind carried no sound, no threat, just quiet. But he knew it wouldn't last. This wasn't the end. He'd fired the first warning. What came next would reach further than Gray Hollow. And Willa, wherever she rode now, would need more than just distance to outrun what was coming. Boone turned and started down the far side of the ridge where the trail east split near the old pine grove. He had one more stop to make before he vanished again. Not a goodbye. Just a visit to the graves he hadn't stood before in 6 long years. Because some lines once crossed don't lead back. They didn't know the cook had once buried men twice their size, and she wasn't about to remind them until they laid hands on that little girl. The back kitchen of the Widow's Lantern Inn was a sweltering box of pine heat and iron pans. Smoke from the hearth curled into the beams. The smell of salt pork, lard biscuits, and scorched onions hung heavy in the air. Miss Bessie didn't look up from her chopping block as the saloon doors flapped again. It was the 3rd time that day some drifter wandered in expecting her to be startled. She wasn't. She never was. Her hands worked the knife steady chop turn slide like clockwork trained by years and scars. The iron stove hissed and cracked a pan of beans simmering low. She wiped sweat from her brow with the same cloth she used to pull hot pans, and when she turned to lift the stew kettle, her sleeves tightened around arms thick with old muscle. She moved heavy but deliberate like a barn door that didn't creak, just closed when it meant to. Out in the dining room, someone let out a loud whistle. "Hey, cook!" a voice barked. "You got eyes in that round head, or you too slow to know when men need feedin'?" Bessie didn't flinch. The barkeep, Dell shot a nervous look through the pass window. "Bessie don't just serve 'em quick, all right." She nodded once, lips pressed tight. She didn't need to remind Dell that she'd worked this place before his whiskers grew in. She'd served miners, gamblers, Pinkertons, and peddlers from Missouri to Montana. The new crop of cowhands Tucker Gray had sent south weren't any different. Loud, young, ugly with the kind of power that came from never being told no. She ladled stew into 3 tin bowls, slid cornbread onto chipped plates, and pushed through the swinging door. Her boots echoed on the scuffed floor. Sunlight slanted in, hard through the front windows, catching dust and the glint of spurs. The men slouched at the corner table, legs, wide eyes mean. One of them had his chair tipped back, a toothpick dangling from his lip. Another one, raw-boned and red-eyed, had a pistol resting loose on the table like it belonged there. Bessie set the bowls down without a word. "That took long enough," said the raw-boned one, poking his spoon at the stew. "What is this pig slop?" The man beside him laughed, reached for the cornbread and shoved half into his mouth. "You're lucky to be eating," Bessie said, her voice low and even. Rawboned leaned forward, squinting. "What did you say?" "I said you're lucky to have a plate." He grinned, ugly and toothy. "You threatenin' me, cook?" "No." She met his gaze. "I'm informing you." The table went still. Even the barkeep held his breath. A boy sweeping near the doorway froze mid-stroke. The third man, smallest of the 3 but wired with something twitchy, muttered, "You don't talk to men like that. Not if you aim to keep standing." Bessie stepped back, hands folded in her apron. Behind her, the kitchen door creaked open. A soft voice floated through. "Miss Bessie, I folded the towels like you said." It was Willa. Small, wide-eyed. The bruises on her arm were still fading, yellowing like old peaches. She stood barefoot in the doorway, holding a stack of linens against her chest. The men turned toward her. "Well, what do we have here?" The twitchy one grinned, sliding his chair back. Bessie moved before he got to his feet. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She just stepped between Willa and the table and grabbed the nearest hot stew bowl, sizzling, bubbling, and threw it in the twitchy man's face. He screamed, clutched his skin, falling backward into his chair. Rawboned lunged, but Bessie had the ladle already swinging. It cracked against his jaw like a hammer, sending him sprawling onto the floor. His pistol clattered across the room. The third man stood frozen, hand half raised. "Don't," Bessie said. "I'll plant you like onions." He hesitated, and that was enough. She kicked the pistol behind her and raised the heavy skillet still steaming from the fire. "Pick up your friend. Get out. And if I ever see you near that girl again, you won't walk back out." Rawboned groaned on the floor, lip-split stew dripping down his shirt. "You crazy," he wheezed. "Finish the sentence," she warned, "and I'll give you the second course." The barkeep had ducked behind the counter but peeked up now, blinking like a man who'd just remembered who he'd hired. Willa stood wide-eyed behind Bessie, still clutching the towels, hands shaking. The three men limped out, one holding his face, another trailing a streak of blood across the doorframe. Nobody said a word until the door slammed behind them and their horses thundered away. Bessie turned, her breath steady now. Willa looked up at her like a child staring at a church angel carved in wood. I didn't mean to. You didn't do anything wrong," Bessie said. "They did. And I told you, didn't I? You're safe in my kitchen." The girl nodded, but tears welled in her eyes anyway. Bessie reached out and set a firm hand on her shoulder. "We don't run from men like that, Willa. Not anymore." The barkeep came out, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know they'll tell Tucker what happened." "I'm counting on it," she said. He blinked. "Why? Because he needs to know," she said. "The child he thought he could toss away has hands protecting her now." She went back to the kitchen, wiping stew off her apron, and set the skillet back on the stove. The fire hissed, and so did she, under her breath, like a vow. Let them come. Let them try. Because this time, she wasn't just cooking meals, she was keeping house, and no devil crossed her threshold without bleeding for it. "If you put your hand on her again," the giant cowboy said, stepping out of the shadows, "I'll put you in the ground beside every man who thought she was weak." The porch boards groaned under the weight of the afternoon sun. Dust hung in the air like it had nowhere else to go, suspended between heat and silence. Inside the Widow's Lantern Inn, the clatter of plates and low hum of conversation masked the tension that had been building all day. The story of what Bessie did to the cowhands spread like wildfire across Split Rock, curling into every corner like smoke from a slow-burning fuse. Some folks admired her spine. Others muttered about how Tucker Gray wouldn't take kindly to his men getting whipped by a cook and a pan. But Tucker hadn't come yet. He sent a man instead. Not one of the loud ones. Not one of the boys who swaggered through town like they'd been promised something by blood. No, this one came quiet. A wiry, gray-bearded man named Silas Greer, who wore a battered hat low and kept one gloved hand inside his duster the whole time. He waited until late afternoon, when Bessie sent Willa to gather eggs from the henhouse behind the inn. Silas leaned against the doorframe, watching with narrowed eyes. Bessie saw him before he said a word. She set down her mixing bowl and wiped her hands. "You lost, Silas." "No, ma'am," he said evenly. "I'm exactly where Tucker sent me." She crossed her arms. "Then he's more coward than I thought." Silas didn't flinch. "He said you'd say that. Said you'd think throwing stew at boys makes you queen of the mountain." Bessie smiled without warmth. "He teach you to hide behind children, too." Silas's gaze flicked to the back window. "That girl ain't yours, Bessie. She's mine until she's safe. She was Tucker's niece before she ever knew your name. She was Tucker's chew toy before she ever knew kindness." Silas stepped off the wall, voice quiet. "You got two choices, Miss Bessie. Send the girl out and Tucker won't burn this place to the ground. Or you keep her and I come back with men who won't stop at stew." The wind stirred the curtains. Somewhere out back a hen clucked and flapped. Bessie didn't answer right away. Then she reached behind her apron, pulled out the carving knife she used for Sunday roasts, and planted it blade down in the butcher block with a heavy thunk. "Then you better bring a coffin, Silas, and make sure it fits a man your size." Silas stared at the blade. He didn't laugh, didn't blink. He just nodded slowly. Suit yourself. And he left without another word. By evening, the sky darkened into a sullen bruise, and the wind came down from the ridge with an edge to it. Willa didn't ask about the man in the hat. She just stayed near Bessie all night, folding napkins, setting water glasses, and pausing every so often, like she was trying to hear something no one else could. She didn't speak until after the last customer had gone, and the lanterns flickered low. "Miss Bessie, if he comes, I don't want you to get hurt." Bessie looked up from the dough she was kneading. "I've been hurt, child. Ain't a soul breathing who ain't." Willa's voice barely carried, but not because of me. Bessie came around the counter, flour still on her hands. She bent down until she was eye to eye with the girl. "I've spent most of my life wishing I'd stepped in sooner for someone. Wishing I'd opened my mouth, swung my pan, or said no when it mattered. I ain't missing this one." Willa nodded slowly, but she was trembling again. And when the knock came at the door, soft and slow like it didn't mean anything, it still made her jump. Bessie moved first, but as she reached the door, a voice spoke from the porch, low, measured, firm as winter ground. "You open it fast, or I kick it in." She froze, then opened it. The man who filled the doorway wasn't one of Tucker's boys. He wasn't like Silas either. He stood tall, broad as a barn beam with shoulders that made the night seem smaller. His hat was off, hanging from his fingers. His hair curled damp from the rain that had just started, and his eyes were pale and dangerous. "I'm not here for stew," he said. "I'm here for the girl." Willa whimpered behind the counter. Bessie's voice cracked like firewood. "You're not taking her." The man stepped in, slow, his boots leaving wet marks on the floor. "She's Tucker Gray's blood. You're harboring a runaway. I'm keeping her safe. She don't look hurt. She don't have to look it." The man's eyes flicked to the back corner where Willa crouched. "She'll come with me," he said, "one way or another." And then he reached for her, but he never got the chance to lay a hand, because the back wall split open with a boom, and a figure stepped out of the shadows, taller than the man who just threatened them, shoulders, square jaw, clenched his coat, still carrying flakes of pine from the trail. The giant cowboy. He'd been gone for days up the pass gathering timber. Now he stood with the wind behind him, filling the doorway like a judgment. "If you put your hand on her again," he said, voice dark and thick with iron, "I'll put you in the ground beside every man who thought she was weak." The other man stepped back, startled. "You got no say in this." "I do now," the cowboy said, and his hand fell to the axe still strapped to his belt. Not a gun. An axe. And somehow that was worse. The man hesitated, then sneered. "You're going to risk your life for a cook and a throwaway brat." The cowboy stepped forward, slow. "That's not a cook. That's the woman who fed half this county when their cellars ran dry. And that girl's not a throwaway." He paused. "She's mine now." The silence that followed stretched long and taut. Then the man backed away, muttering curses under his breath, and slipped into the dark. When the door shut, Willa burst into sobs. The cowboy didn't say anything. He just walked to her and knelt, pulling her into a quiet embrace. She clung to him like she didn't know how to let go. Bessie stood still, one hand on the counter, watching them. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, and for the first time in days, no one knocked again. "I'm not afraid of being broken," Bessie said, quiet as a prayer. "I'm afraid of never being whole again." Rain tapped the windows like a metronome, slow and steady. It had been coming down since before dawn, soaking the dirt road and turning the hills into gray smudges. Inside the widow's lantern, the fire crackled with damp logs, and the air smelled of cedar smoke and cornbread. The morning was still. Too still. Willa hadn't left her bed in the loft. Bessie had peeked up once early, just enough to see the girl curled beneath the quilt, eyes, wide-open arms, wrapped tight around herself, like a child clinging to the last scrap of a dream. No words, just silence. The cowboy was downstairs, already seated near the hearth, with his long legs stretched out, the flickering light brushing the worry from his brow. He hadn't spoken much since the night he'd returned, since he'd faced down that man in the doorway and claimed Willa as if she were kin. Bessie poured coffee into a chipped mug and brought it to him without a word. He nodded his thanks and cradled it in both hands, steam curling beneath his nose. "She's not eaten," he said after a while, voice low. "I know." "She say anything?" Bessie shook her head. Not a word. The cowboy's eyes wandered toward the stairs. "She needs to know it's over." Bessie gave him a long look. "It's never really over. Not for girls like her." He sipped slow. "For girls like you too." Bessie's hands paused on the towel she was folding. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and moved back to the counter, smoothing the towel like it needed soothing. "I remember the first time someone looked at me the way he looked at her," she said. "Like I owed him my skin. Like my silence was part of the deal." The cowboy didn't move. "I was 16. Could have screamed, but I didn't. Thought if I stayed quiet, he'd stop sooner. Thought if I made myself small, I'd disappear. But he didn't. And I didn't." Her voice trembled but never broke. "I'm not afraid of being broken," she said, quiet as a prayer. "I'm afraid of never being whole again." The cowboy rose slow and heavy. He crossed the floor and stood beside her, not touching, just near enough to make her feel the warmth of his presence. "You're whole to me," he said. She swallowed hard. "I'm patched. So's every barn that ever stood 100 winters." A soft breath left her lips. She nodded just once, and for a moment the silence wasn't sharp. It was soft, like wool washed 1,000 times. Upstairs, they heard a creak, then another. Willa came down barefoot, one hand trailing along the banister, the other holding the blanket tight around her shoulders. She looked pale, but the color hadn't vanished entirely from her cheeks. She stopped at the bottom step, uncertain. The cowboy straightened, stepping back to give her room. "Mornin', sunshine." Willa looked at him, eyes red but alert. She tried to speak but couldn't. Bessie stepped forward, arms open, but Willa held up a hand. "I need to tell you both something," she whispered. They waited. "I lied to you." The air in the room went still. Willa looked down at her bare feet, words tumbling out in a rush. "That man, he wasn't just sent by Tucker. He was Tucker's son. I knew it when I saw his eyes. I didn't tell you because I thought maybe if I kept it to myself, he wouldn't find me again." The cowboy's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. "I'm not just some runaway. Tucker's been looking for me for months. Not because he wants me back, but because I know something. Something he did. Something that could ruin him." She looked up, face pale but defiant. "He hurt more than just me. I saw things. I heard things. His own ranch hands whisper about the girls who disappear. But I'm the only one who got away." Bessie moved to her, wrapping her arms around the girl and holding tight. The cowboy's voice was gravel. "You should have told us. I was scared. You still are." She nodded against Bessie's shoulder. "I don't want to go back." "You won't." They sat together by the fire that day, the three of them. Willa spoke more, each word like peeling off a bandage, slow, painful, necessary. She spoke of rooms with no windows, of men who turned away, of nights where the door never stayed shut. And through it all, Bessie never flinched. The cowboy never turned away. They listened. They believed her. That night, long after Willa had fallen asleep on a cot near the fire, the cowboy stood by the back door, staring into the dark. "He won't stop," he said. "No," Bessie murmured. "We can't stay here forever." "No." He turned to her eyes like the low burning coals in the hearth. "You ever think about leaving every day?" He looked back out the door. The rain had stopped. The night was still. "You think she could handle it?" Bessie didn't answer for a long time. Then she stepped up beside him, wrapped her shawl tighter, and said the only thing that mattered. "She's already handled worse." The cowboy nodded. His fingers rested on the handle of the axe hanging by the door. He didn't grip it, just touched it like a promise. The fire popped softly behind them. The air outside smelled of wet cedar and the hush before dawn. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And not one of them would face it alone. "Some things you don't run from," the cowboy said, tightening the saddle. "Some things you face head on so they know you ain't the one who breaks." The wind had shifted by morning. It came down from the north, tugging at the eaves of the widow's lantern, rustling the bare branches, like a warning whispered through the hills. The sky hung low and bruised. There was a silence to the land, not peace but a hush before the thunder. The cowboy stood out by the hitching post, hands steady as he saddled the gelding. Every movement was deliberate, straps tightened, stirrups checked, rifle secured behind the cantle. His jaw worked as he chewed over the plan again and again, but no new answer came. Inside, Bessie packed up bread jerky and a cloth-wrapped wedge of smoked cheese into a knapsack. She moved fast, no wasted motion, no small talk. Willa sat at the table watching with wide, unblinking eyes. "I want to come," she said softly. Bessie looked at her but didn't stop folding. "You can't." "I'm not afraid. That ain't the point." Bessie said, "You've been hunted, hurt, left for dead. You need rest. What's coming? It ain't your fire to walk through." Willa's chin lifted. "It is. He's after me." Bessie paused, hands pressed against the table. "That's exactly why you stay. He doesn't get to take your peace, too." The door creaked open, letting in a gust of wind and the smell of cold leather and pine. "He's already closed," the cowboy said, stepping inside. "Two men rode past the mill this morning. Jonah saw 'em, didn't recognize their brands." Bessie nodded once and handed him the knapsack. "They're scouting." He took the bag. "Likely, testing the waters before the storm." "I said I want to come," Willa repeated. The cowboy looked at her, then to Bessie. "You should let her speak it out," he said. "She doesn't need to be part of this." He crouched down in front of Willa, quiet level. "You know how to shoot," Willa blinked. "A little. Ever killed anything that looked back at you?" Her breath caught. He didn't blink. "You come with me, it might not be Tucker you face. Might be someone meaner. Might be yourself." Willa's hands trembled, but she didn't back down. "I'm done hiding." He studied her another long beat, then stood and turned back to Bessie. "She stays," he said firmly. "But we'll set a signal if things go wrong." "What kind of signal? If I come riding fast from the ridge too fast to wave, that's your sign." Bessie crossed her arms. "And if you don't come at all?" He glanced out the window toward the hills. "Then burn everything behind you and take her as far as the river will carry." Willa stood, suddenly panic flashing across her face. "No, please don't go alone." The cowboy stepped close and rested a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I ain't alone," he said. "You're right here. And I got angels on both sides." The girl's lip quivered. "Promise you'll come back." He didn't promise. He just touched the brim of his hat, turned, and stepped outside into the wind. Bessie watched him go, her fingers tight around the spoon in the pot. She wasn't stirring anymore. Willa sat back down, arms hugging her middle like she was trying to hold herself together from the inside. Time passed slow. The wind picked up. And then the first shot came like thunder cracking over the ridge. Bessie spun toward the window. "He said he'd be fast," Willa whispered, but the echo came again, another crack, then two more in rhythm closer now. She grabbed the shotgun from behind the stove and ran for the door, Willa close behind her. Out on the porch, the hills unfolded in bleak gray. The trees danced wildly, shadows moving between trunks. Another shot. Bessie's breath hitched. That's his rifle. And then she saw him. The cowboy crested the hill on horseback, hat, gone blood on his sleeve, and a fury in his face like a man who'd already looked death in the eye and spat. Behind him, two riders gave chase guns drawn. He wasn't riding fast to run, he was leading them. Bessie stepped forward and lifted the shotgun, bracing it against the post. Willa reached for the rifle, leaning beside the rocking chair. The cowboy veered left at the last second, cutting across the orchard. That's when they saw the trap. The first rider followed hard, not seeing the low rope stretched between the stakes Bessie had driven into the ground days ago just in case. His horse hit it and flipped, sending man and beast into the mud with a sickening crunch. The second rider tried to pull back, but the cowboy had turned, wheeled the gelding mid-gallop, and drawn the rifle one-handed. One shot. The second rider slumped and fell. Silence. Willa stood frozen on the porch steps. Rifle half lifted, her breath sharp in her chest. The cowboy slowed as he approached, blood dripping down his temple, mud caking his boots. "Willa," he called, voice hoarse. "You still got that grit in you?" She stared at him, dazed. "Yes." He smiled, grim and broken. "Good. We ain't done yet." And that's when the fourth shot came, one no one saw coming. Bessie screamed. The cowboy jerked, stumbled from his horse, and hit the ground hard. A shadow stepped out from behind the shed. Tucker. Still alive. Still hunting. Bessie raised the shotgun and fired, but Tucker dropped low and rolled, returning fire. Willa didn't wait. She moved like she was born in the storm. She ran, down the steps, across the yard, straight toward the cowboy's fallen rifle. Tucker saw her and smiled that crooked smile. "You run like your mother," he sneered. "Too slow." Willa dropped to her knees, grabbed the rifle, and looked up through the scope. Her fingers shook. Tucker raised his pistol. "You ain't got it in you," he said. Her lips parted and her voice was steady. "I do now." She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. Tucker fell, face first. The wind howled through the trees and then finally stilled. Bessie ran to the cowboy, dropping beside him. "I'm all right," he groaned, pressing a hand to the graze along his ribs. "Just a scratch." Willa stood over them, rifle clutched to her chest, eyes wide, heart thundering. The cowboy looked up at her and nodded. "Some things," he said, "you don't run from." The lantern flickered low in the corner of the room as Bessie stitched the wound with hands steadier than her breath. The cowboy lay half-conscious on the cot, one eye swollen, the other, barely tracking movement. Mud crusted his boots, and blood seeped through the makeshift bandage Willa had wrapped around his ribs when they dragged him inside. Every time the needle pierced flesh, he grunted but didn't flinch. "You should have stayed down," Bessie murmured. "You're not made of iron, no matter how many times you act like it." The cowboy gave a weak chuckle. "Ain't trying to be iron. Just trying not to die with unfinished business." Willa sat in the corner, arms around her knees. Her face was pale, eyes swollen from holding in too much. The rifle leaned beside her. She hadn't let it go since the shot that brought Tucker down. She hadn't said much either. Her silence ran deeper than fear. "You killed him," Bessie said, glancing over. "You saved us." Willa's gaze stayed on the floorboards. He was going to kill you both. You didn't blink. That says something. It says I waited too long. He still hurt him. The cowboy shifted and winced. That man would have found us no matter what. You bought us a chance. Willa didn't reply. She stared at the floor like it held answers, like maybe if she waited long enough, her mother would walk through the door and gather her up, brush back her hair, and tell her none of this had ever happened. But the house stayed quiet save for the storm dying on the porch and the quiet sounds of thread pulling through torn skin. Bessie tied off the stitch, wiped her hands on a rag, and sighed. He's stable, but he's gonna need days, maybe weeks to move like he used to. I don't have weeks, the cowboy said. You do if I say so. He opened his mouth, but the look Bessie gave him was enough to shut it again. Willa stood slowly. If he can't go, I will. Bessie turned sharply. No, you won't. Why not? Because there's more of them. Tucker didn't ride alone. He never did. Then someone needs to finish it. And you think that's you? I'm not a child anymore. No, Bessie said gently. But you're not whole either. You're still bleeding inside, and that's a dangerous kind of wound. It'll make you reckless. The wind rattled the window pane, and outside the clouds broke just enough to show a sliver of moon. Willa walked to the window, hands clenched at her sides. He said he'd be back, she whispered. Before he died. He said I reminded him of her. The cowboy stirred. You do. Willa turned. She died protecting me. She stood between me and a bullet, and you want me to stand behind curtains and wait while the rest of the world burns. The cowboy looked at her. Really looked this time. His voice was hoarse. You remember what I said? Some things you don't run from. She nodded once. Well, here's the truth. Some things you don't chase either. Not when the fight's still coming for you. But if they're regrouping, if they know where we are. They do, Bessie said flatly. Which is why we leave. The cowboy tried to sit up, groaning. We can't leave. Not yet. Not while they still think this place is easy pickings. We're not soldiers, Bessie said. We're tired folks with wounded hearts and one working shotgun between us. I'm not leaving my land. It ain't your land anymore if it costs you your life. The silence that fell after that was thick, like smoke hanging in the air after a gunfight. Willa stepped back from the window. We can't go far with him like this. Bessie looked from Willa to the cot, then to the fading storm outside. There's a cave up by Miller's Ridge, she said finally. No one's used it in years. If we leave tonight, we might make it before sunrise. The cowboy closed his eyes. I hate caves. You'll hate dying more. We can't stay gone forever. No, but we can make them think we did. Willa frowned. You want to fake our retreat. If they come looking and see this place abandoned, Bessie explained, they'll assume we ran. Folks like that don't chase ghosts. The cowboy grunted. Until they catch wind, we're still breathing. That buys us time. I say we take it. Willa crossed her arms. And then what? Bessie turned to her. Then we do what we've always done, girl. We survive the dark. We rebuild. Outside, the wind picked up again, restless, colder now. The cowboy tried to rise, legs wobbling under him. Bessie stepped in and steadied him, slinging his arm over her shoulder. We move at moonrise, she said. Pack light. Willa nodded and finally set the rifle down. She walked slowly toward the back room where the old trunk held the last of her mother's things. She opened it and pulled out a wool shawl and a folded handkerchief with a faded bluebird stitched into the corner. She slipped it into her pocket. Then she closed the trunk and left it behind. By the time the moon broke free of the clouds, The three of them stood beneath the bare arms of the black oaks, bundled against the chill, their backs to the widow's lantern. The house loomed behind them, silent as a grave. "I lit the lamp," Bessie said quietly. "Let it burn down on its own." Willa looked back one last time. The porch where she'd sat shelling beans with her mother. The kitchen window that used to glow golden with supper on the stove. The squeaky screen door that banged every time her father came home late. None of it felt real anymore. And yet, all of it did. The cowboy took the first step toward the ridge, then another. Bessie followed. Willa glanced down at the rifle in her hands. Her fingers tightened around it. She followed them into the woods, and behind them, the house stood still, waiting for whatever came next. "You survive the dark," Bessie had said. "You rebuild." But Willa knew the truth now. They weren't just running anymore. They were drawing the next battle line in the shadows. The cave smelled of damp earth and cedar roots, its walls slick with decades of hidden weather. Moss clung to the crevices, and the entrance was narrow enough that even Willa had to duck. It wasn't warm, but it was dry, and for now it was theirs. The cowboy had collapsed the moment they laid him down near the far wall, his breath ragged but steady. Bessie unpacked a satchel of dried meat, old crackers, and a flask of cold creek water. Willa gathered twigs and a bit of pine bark to build a small fire near the entrance, just enough for warmth, not enough to smoke them out or catch eyes in the dark. None of them spoke for a long while. The fire cracked softly, casting orange shadows across the cowboy's face, lighting up the jagged line of stitches along his ribs. His hat lay beside him, brim torn. He looked smaller now, no less strong, but less like the man who once rode into a town and made the dust pause mid-air. Willa watched him sleep, her fingers curled around her knees. She hadn't removed her boots. She didn't trust rest. Her whole body was alert, tense, like a stretched wire. But inside that tension, something else stirred. "I used to play here," she said quietly. Bessie looked up. "Here before Mama died. She'd bring me up here when she needed quiet. Said the stone kept secrets, said it was holy." Bessie nodded slowly. "Your mother always did believe places held memory." She'd hummed to herself. Said the world was too loud sometimes, and a person had to go somewhere the wind couldn't find them. She was right about that. Willa looked into the flames. "I think I hate this place now." Bessie leaned forward, her hands warmed near the fire. "You hate what happened. The place didn't do it. I left her behind. She told you to run. I did. She died saving you." Willa's throat burned. "Then why does it still feel like I failed her?" The silence sat heavy between them. Bessie reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of fabric, an old embroidered cloth. She handed it to Willa. "What's this?" "She gave it to me before she passed. Told me you'd need it one day." Willa unfolded it carefully. Stitched into the cloth were faded red letters, worn from time, but still legible. "They don't get the last word unless you let them." Willa swallowed hard. "She meant them men," she asked. "She meant all of it," Bessie said. "Fear, pain, shame. All the things that try to shrink you down." Willa ran her fingers over the stitches. The thread was rough, the kind that caught if you rubbed too long. She held it against her chest. The cowboy stirred behind them, his voice a whisper. That was her phrase. They turned. "She said it to me once," he continued, "when I tried to leave after she was gone. Told me I couldn't outrun ghosts, but I could learn to talk louder than them." Bessie moved to check his bandage. Willa looked back at the fire. "What if I don't want to talk louder? What if I just want to burn the whole past down? Then you best be careful not to burn yourself with it," Bessie said. Outside, a twig snapped. The three of them froze. Another step. Not animal, not wind. Willa reached for the rifle. The cowboy tried to rise, but the pain pulled him back down. She crept toward the cave mouth and flattened herself against the wall, listening. Silence. Then a voice, low and cautious. "Willa, that you?" She blinked. Her hand tightened on the rifle. "Who's asking? It's Caleb. I came from the South Trail, saw the lamp burning in your window last night. Followed tracks." Willa hesitated, then stepped out slowly, rifle still raised. A tall, lean boy stepped forward with hands lifted in the moonlight. His face was dirt-smeared and drawn, his eyes too old for his years. But Willa remembered him. He used to help her father fix fence posts before everything fell apart. "What do you want? I came to warn you." She narrowed her eyes. "About what? Tucker's kin. They came back through town. They're blaming you. Said you lured him out, ambushed him." "That's a lie. I know. But no one else does. And they've stirred up some men from the next town over. They're looking to make an example out of somebody." Bessie appeared behind her. "How many? 5? Maybe 6. One of them carries that long-barreled Sharps. They're not just talking. They're riding out tomorrow." Willa lowered the rifle, but didn't relax. "Why come tell us?" Caleb shifted. "Because you don't deserve what's coming. And because I owe you for that winter you gave us dry wood when our chimney collapsed." Willa stared at him, then gave a slight nod. "You're staying the night?" "No, I'll circle back. Leave no trail." She handed him a strip of jerky. "Then don't get caught." He vanished like a shadow into the trees. Back inside, Willa paced the embroidered cloth clenched in her fist. Bessie was already gathering supplies. The cowboy, half sitting now, looked up at her. "They're coming sooner than we thought," Willa said. "Then we don't run," he said. She met his eyes. "We prepare." "Where?" Bessie asked. Willa looked down at the cloth in her hand, then back up. "At the river bend, where the birch trees bend low." "Mama used to take me there, said the land was shaped like a shield." "That's where we'll stand," the cowboy said. Willa nodded once. She stepped out of the cave and looked into the stars overhead. Her voice, soft but firm, carried back inside. "They don't get the last word unless we let them." And in that moment, she decided they never would. The wind off the river came sharp and cold, tugging at Willa's coat as she stood at the crest of the bend. The birch trees around her bowed and whispered like old women sharing secrets. Each pale trunk shimmered in the morning light, their thin white bark peeling back like quiet paper wounds. The ground was muddy soft with runoff, but the earth rose behind them in a shallow hill natural cover. Natural defense. Bessie moved quickly, dragging brushwood into place and laying traps with the quiet intensity of someone who'd lived too long in the shadows to waste time now. The cowboy, his arm still in a sling and one side of his shirt crusted with blood, was propped against a tree, carving narrow grooves into the butt of his rifle. His breath was shallow, but his eyes were clear. Focused. Willa hadn't spoken much since Caleb left. She worked in silence, stacking logs behind their position, smoothing a lookout trench into the slope with her boot. Her muscles ached, but she didn't feel it. Her grief had sharpened into something lean and bright. A blade. She tied Mama's embroidered cloth around her left wrist. The words, though faded, pulsed like a heartbeat against her skin. "This land's been soaked in the wrong blood long enough." She turned and looked at them both. "We make our stand here. Not out of pride, out of promise." The cowboy looked up. To who? To her? To the ones who didn't get to speak back? Bessie straightened. "Then we hold the line." By late morning, clouds had begun to churn low over the treetops, the color of iron. A few birds flew low, unsettled. The river behind them rippled fast and loud, its sound masking small movements. It was the kind of day where silence didn't feel empty, it felt tense, like something crouched just out of sight. They heard the riders before they saw them, hooves steady and slow, not charging, not rushing, coming. Willa flattened behind the fallen log rifle, ready, her cheek pressed to the wood. Bessie was lower near the left flank, her hat pulled down low and a pistol drawn. The cowboy sat still against the tree rifle across his lap, his breath timed with the wind. The first figure emerged around the bend, long black coat, flat-brimmed hat, rifle slung across the front of his saddle. Behind him 5 more. One with a red scarf tied tight around his neck. One older with a beard split white down the center. And another, the one with the Sharp's rifle strapped to his back. Willa didn't move. They stopped 100 yards away, horses snorting and stomping. The man in the black coat lifted a hand. "We ain't here for theatrics," he called. "Bring out the girl and the wounded man, and we'll let the other woman go free." Bessie smiled to herself without humor. The cowboy chuckled. "He thinks he's got leverage." Willa stood slowly. "You've got nothing but hot air and stolen names." The man squinted. "You're Willa, that's right." He dismounted with a grunt, walked a few paces forward. "You're harboring a criminal. He's a witness," Willa said. "To your lies, to what you did to my family." He saw it all. "He's an outlaw." "No," she said, "you are." She could see it now, how tired he looked. How mean tired men got when they felt their power slipping. He rested his hand near the gun at his side. "You've got one chance to hand him over," he said. "After that, we burn this place down." The cowboy raised his voice, calm but cutting. "You'll burn nothing. You forgot who built this land before you started scarring it." The man sneered. "Big words from a broken man. I've been broken before," the cowboy replied. "But I've never once been a coward." That did it. The man pulled his pistol. Bessie fired first. The crack echoed off the river like a whip. Chaos! The man spun and fell shot clean through the shoulder. His horse reared and bolted. The others scrambled, one dove behind a tree. Another returned fire blindly. Willa aimed and shot the man with the red scarf, clipping his thigh and sending him tumbling off his horse. The cowboy, breathing hard, took aim and hit the man with the Sharps square in the chest before he could level the rifle. The thud was solid, final. Smoke filled the clearing, thin and sharp. One rider fled, another knelt, raising his hands. "We're done," he shouted. "We're done." Willa held her aim steady for a long moment before lowering the barrel. The clearing stilled, blood on the snowmelt, horse cries fading into the distance. The cowboy leaned his head back against the tree and closed his eyes. Bessie stood slowly, brushing mud from her knees. Her face was streaked with dirt and ash, but her eyes were dry. Willa walked to the fallen man in the black coat. He clutched his arm and glared up at her. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "No," Willa said. "I know it does." He opened his mouth again, but she raised the rifle. "Try it," she said quietly. "Please." He went silent. Bessie tied his hands while the cowboy dragged himself to sit upright again. They gathered the injured and the dead, laying the latter beneath a thick pine. Willa said no words over them. Some men weren't owed words. As evening settled, Willa walked down to the edge of the river. Her boots sank into the soft ground, and the water rushed cold and quick past her ankles. She didn't cry. She hadn't since Mama died. But something loosened in her chest. Something let go. The cowboy joined her, limping. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I'm freer than I've ever been." He nodded. She looked out over the bend, the trees bowed and whispering still. "They'll come back," she said. "Maybe. They'll want revenge. Probably. And I'll be here," she said. "I'm not running anymore." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin badge, scuffed old, but still intact. He handed it to her. "What's this? My old marshal's badge," he said. "Wasn't much use to me after the war. But maybe it still means something. You defended this place better than most men I've ever known." She stared at it. The metal was cold in her hand. "You sure?" He nodded once. "You earned it." She held it tight. This land's been soaked in the wrong blood long enough, and in her bones she knew there was still more to reckon with. But the reckoning had started, and this time it had her name on it. The morning after the shootout was not silent, it was loud with absence. The river still rushed below, but it sounded different now, like it knew something had passed. The crows didn't return to the trees. The wind shifted course, carrying with it the scent of blood, gunpowder, and pine. Willa stood at the edge of the camp, staring down at the frost-bitten earth where red stains hadn't yet dried. She pressed the old marshal's badge into her palm until the edges dug into her skin. Bessie moved carefully between the scattered supplies, cleaning, repairing, salvaging what could be used. Her jaw was set, her sleeves rolled up past the elbow. Every movement she made was quiet and clean, like someone who'd already buried too many. The cowboy, who still wouldn't say his real name out loud, sat propped against a tree. His wound was bound with torn linen, and his eyes were distant but alert. He hadn't said much, just nodded when Willa gave him water, winced when Bessie changed the dressings, but his rifle sat ready beside him, and his hand rested close. Willa finally moved. She walked past the campfire's smoldering embers and stepped through the brittle brush to where they'd buried the 3 dead men. The shallow graves were marked by stone and silence. One of them was the man who'd tried to burn her family out years ago. Another had stood by while Mama screamed. She knelt beside the last grave, the one belonging to the man with the Sharps rifle. Her voice when it came was thin but steady. "You knew what you were doing. You followed anyway." She didn't stay long. Some graves didn't deserve tears. Back at the fire, Bessie handed her a tin cup of coffee. The heat bit into Willa's numb fingers. "You sure you don't want to head west?" Bessie asked. "I've still got folks near Carson City. We could be gone before nightfall." Willa looked toward the hill, toward the cabin her family had nearly died to keep. The land was battered now, fence broken. The barn door split where a stray bullet had passed through. But it was theirs. Hers. "I'm not leaving," she said. Bessie sighed but didn't argue. "Then we get it ready." They worked through the day. Willa patched the barn with leftover boards. Bessie hauled buckets of water from the river. The cowboy even managed to sit up straighter, cleaning his rifle between coughs. The labor helped. It kept their hands busy while their minds rearranged what they'd seen. By dusk, the land had changed again. Not just in looks, but in feel. It no longer felt like a place borrowed. It felt claimed. A low whistle broke the air. Willa froze. Hoofbeats slow but close. She turned toward the road, hand at her hip. But the figure coming through the tree line wasn't an enemy. It was a boy, maybe 12, riding bareback on a shaggy pony. His clothes were threadbare, his face streaked with dirt. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand. He reined in just short of the cabin eyes, wide as dinner plates. "You the one they call Willa Willa," stepped forward. "Who wants to know?" He handed her the note. "A woman at the trading post gave it to me. Said it was important." Willa unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was rushed, but she recognized it. It was Eliza's. "They're coming. Not just for you, but for everything. saw them meet with Braxton men. I'm leaving. I'll be back when it's safe. Protect what's yours. No signature, just the truth scrawled in fear. Willa crumpled the paper in her hand. Who's Eliza? Bessie asked, frowning. Someone I used to trust. The cowboy narrowed his eyes. Sounds like she still trusts you. Willa didn't answer right away. She stared toward the tree line where dusk was beginning to pull shadows longer across the hills. She was Mama's friend, once she finally said. Helped me find out who really set the fire. Helped me track them to the marshal's post. Bessie raised an eyebrow. You think she's telling the truth? I do. Bessie folded her arms. Then we need to prepare. Willa shook her head. No, we need to send a message. That night they rode out. All three of them. Willa left Bessie at the church near the town edge with a rifle and a signal lantern. She and the cowboy moved through the pines in near silence, skirting the old Braxton homestead, a place once crawling with hired guns and fear. But tonight, it sat quiet. Almost too quiet. They waited until a sliver past midnight. Then Willa struck the match. The first barn went up like dry tinder. Flames leapt skyward, orange streaks against the black night. The horses bolted. Shouts rang out. Willa didn't look back. She ran with the wind behind her. The cowboy trailed, breathing hard but grinning wide. They didn't stop until they reached the ridge above town. From there the flames were a red flower blooming in the dark. The Braxtons would know. The message was clear. Willa stood tall against the cold. You can steal a name, but you can't bury the truth. The cowboy leaned against a rock, wheezing laughter. You always this dramatic? No, she said. Just done being quiet. The wind shifted again, pulling the smoke westward. From the ridge, the valley below looked smaller now. The buildings, the barns, the dirt paths they used to call roads. All of it smaller than her rage, smaller than her resolve. She slid the badge from her pocket and held it to the light. The edges were blackened now from fire, but the shape still held. The name was still etched. Marshall W. Dalton. Not her name? Not yet. But soon. She turned away from the flames and walked down the ridge. The cowboy followed, limping but steady. The land behind them burned, but the path ahead glowed. The educational lesson learned from this story is that dignity and strength often rise quietly from the ashes of hardship. Even when we're bruised by betrayal or underestimated by others, there's still power in standing our ground and protecting what we hold dear. Life may not always offer justice right away, but perseverance rooted in truth and quiet courage can restore more than what was lost. Sometimes healing a broken past begins not with vengeance, but with reclaiming your voice.